Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. The US is gearing up to turn a trade war into a capital war. Trump's signature fiscal bill proposes retaliatory levies on investors from countries the US deems to have unfair tax regimes. But what exactly counts as an unfair tax? How likely is this to become law?
And what could it mean for investors holding US assets or doing business in America? And in today's dumb question of the week, what is capital flight? All right, let's get into it. So, Romin, you and I, it's fair to say, hate talking about taxes. And even more so, we hate talking about US taxes. But as global investors, sadly, sometimes we have to interact with the American tax system and all its complexities. And it's getting more complex and punishing for foreign investors. The financial media seems to be getting obsessed by Section 899. What's all this about?
Well, I think a good place to start is why the US is such an attractive place to invest. It's got hugely deep capital markets. Historically, it's had great returns. And there's been very little in terms of restrictions for foreign investors. Also, I think it was quite transparent and stable in terms of the rules about what you could invest in and the taxes that were involved. So we kind of knew that if you invested in the US with a global index fund or with a US specific fund, you'd have to pay some kind of withholding tax. That's something we've discussed before. The idea there is that if a company in the US pays out a dividend, some of that dividend is withheld and not paid to you. And the withholding tax depends on the jurisdiction. For example, an ETF domiciled in Ireland would pay 15% withholding tax for US income, whereas in Luxembourg you'd pay 30%. So this is something we were kind of aware of, but I think this new rule really shakes things up.
So for the three people still listening to this show now, the reason Ireland, for example, pays a lower withholding tax than Luxembourg is because of the details of the double taxation treaty with America. And the UK also benefits from some reduced withholding tax rates similar to Ireland. Now, what's changing is that the House of Representatives in America has just passed the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which makes a lot of different changes to the American tax system. And it's actually over 1,000 pages long, so the big bit is certainly accurate in the title of the bill. And buried within there, in Section 899, so, you've read through 898 sections, you're going, okay, this is not too bad, I'm surviving. You get to 899 and you're like, Jesus, what have they done?
So we already have a system where they're taxing imports into the United States based on the country the imports are coming from. Now what we're seeing is an increase in the taxes for any kind of income paid out by US investments. Now, that's not necessarily going to be frozen. It's going to start at a surtax, that's in addition to what you were paying before, of 5%, and then it can increase annually in steps of 5% up to a maximum of 20%. So it's not a small tax. This is going to have a huge impact if you're one of the countries which is in the crosshairs.
So before we come on to which countries could potentially get hit by this, because remember, it's not law yet, let's discuss how it actually works in practice. So as we said, the US has a withholding tax. The general rate of that is 30%. So if a company pays a dividend and you're a foreign investor that owns that company, the US taxman is taking 30% of it before you even see it. Now there's ways to reduce it. Like we said, in the UK, it might be 15%. But if this ratchet goes all the way up to an additional 20%, that 30% withholding tax becomes 50%. And it's not just dividends this is targeting. The legislation talks about various forms of income, interest, rents, royalties, but also income from real estate investment trusts, and even things like the profits made by a US subsidiary of a multinational firm could be subject to this escalatory tax. And the reason that they claim they're bringing this in is in retaliation for what the US perceives to be unfair tax practices by foreign countries.
Now, clearly in this trade war, one of the most damaging things that a country can do in retaliation to the US tariffs is to impose digital service taxes, because a lot of the exports from the US are digital services. We all use things like Google, and Microsoft Cloud services, all of this stuff often comes from the United States. So imposing a digital tax on that is going to be painful for the US.
And a lot of countries have brought in digital taxes. The UK has one, France has one. Germany's talking about a huge one of maybe like 10%, which would really get the backs up of the American administration.
Another tax which the bill explicitly names is undertaxed profits rules. Now, what on earth is that, Michael? I've never heard of it.
Well, I'll put my tax hat on and give you my layman's understanding of this thing. So, as I understand it, countries around the world for a long time have thought that it's a bit unfair that a multinational can go and incorporate itself in like the Cayman Islands or something, pay little or no corporation tax, and pull all its profits from around the world at the expense of the taxpayers in Europe and America and where else. So the OECD got together and all the countries, or a lot of them, agreed to sign on to this treaty effectively, whereby if a multinational was based in a country where they were paying less than 15% corporation tax, other countries could basically tax them despite them not being domiciled there. So they can sort of say, if you're not going to tax them, we will. And America was key in drafting these rules, but then when Trump came to power, I believe he pulled them out of the agreement and said, we don't like this because it might affect our tech companies and other American businesses. So they're now seeing this as an unfair foreign tax. But most countries in the world, certainly in the West, are signed up to this regime. So pretty much everyone in the EU, the UK, Australia, Canada. You know, if America decides this is an unfair tax and we're going to punish you, well, they're going to war with the world, really.
Well, that's crazy because I know the US does a similar thing. They have the Base Erosion and Anti-Abuse Tax, or BEAT, which is introduced for that very reason. It's to avoid multinationals not paying tax in the US and jiggling their payments so that they pay less tax in the US.
Yes, unfair taxes for me, not for thee, Romin. But there's also a clause in this section 899 which says the US Treasury can designate any tax around the world to be unfair if it so decides. And the upshot of all this is, if the US says, excuse me, you're running an unfair tax regime, we're now going to kick in this section 899 surtax charge, and it's going to escalate every year until you scrap your unfair taxes.
Well, I hope the UK doesn't have those three categories, Michael, because that would be awful.
We have all three of them, as do quite a lot of countries. This is what I said. The US is basically saying that the whole world needs to change their tax regime.
Okay, so we are in the crosshairs. So maybe this isn't going to happen. I'm trying to put my optimist hat on here.
Well, it has been passed by the House of Representatives, but that's not enough to make something law. It still has to get through the Senate, where you'd expect it to be modified, and then the president has to sign it eventually.
Now, the whole system in the US, the political system, is geared up to have checks and balances. And one of those checks and balances is that there's this upper house, just as we have the House of Lords in the UK. And they provide a little bit of smoothing when it comes to new legislation. So maybe there won't be so much under the control of President Trump. So I see currently under the 119th Congress, out of 100 seats in the Senate, only 53 of them are Republican. So perhaps there won't be such a degree of control and it won't just be nodding through this bill. And I suspect there's going to be huge pushback against this Section 899. If only for reasons of sanity. For example, if you look at treasuries, they'll become much less attractive for foreign investors if there's some kind of tax on treasury income. The whole point of buying a treasury, part of it, is to get that income. And if you're going to be taxed on it more heavily, potentially up to, say, 50%, well, what's the point?
Well, interestingly, treasuries are the one thing where it's ambiguous about whether they come under the legislation. Presently, there's not withholding tax on treasuries. So if this did apply, it might get up to 20%. But I think the question we should address first is, why is the US considering this approach? I came across a good quote from George Saravaloss, who's an analyst at Deutsche Bank. And he said, Section 899 challenges the open nature of US capital markets by explicitly using taxation on foreign holdings of US assets as leverage to further US economic goals.
And coming back to our opening statements, I think the attraction of the United States was that those controls were limited. You could quite freely invest in the US without having to worry about these whims of politicians. And this definitely makes the US less attractive as a destination for capital. So I think there's going to be big pushback in the Senate against this. And there'll be lots of lobbying from companies which are interested in keeping up the value of US investments.
I find it interesting that it's verging on capital controls. It's not really capital controls in the traditional sense where you might see licenses and mandate and just restrictions on what investors can do with their money. But it's more like trying to control capital flows through pricing mechanisms, just making it more expensive for investors to interact with the US financial system. But really, I think this is being put out there as a kind of deterrent or a negotiating tool by the Trump administration saying, look what we can do. If you go after our tech companies, we'll go after your investors.
Unfortunately, I think one of the unintended consequences of this is that it's going to make US assets much less attractive. And it's just one more nail in the coffin of US exceptionalism. This really is a nuclear option. And also the uncertainty it creates for foreign investors is itself going to be problematic. So even if it doesn't get passed, I think it really is a bit of an own goal for the United States.
The way it's drafted in the bill makes me think it's explicitly being used as negotiating leverage, because the way it envisages these escalating rates of tax coming in is with little delays. So if the US says you're running an unfair tax regime, these retaliatory levies come in 180 days after the foreign unfair tax is enacted. So it's basically giving a little window for negotiation, I think. But do you think it could work? Like, has the US got enough might for the UK, for example, to go, you know what? We don't really need this little bit of income we get from US tech companies. We'll just get rid of our digital service tax.
I think if the government had to choose, the decision was really based on how unpopular it's going to be. And I think if people's pensions are affected by this, and they would be, that would be a problem. But I think people wouldn't really be up in arms about this because they're not aware of how important withholding taxes are. People glaze over when you talk about taxes. And if you start to talk about basis points, well, who cares?
Yeah, all the impacts on investors are kind of a bit opaque. However, I think the impact on business could be much more noticeable. Like, it's interesting, isn't it, that the US is trying to encourage foreign firms to set up factories in the US, for example, but now is seeming to say, well, if you do that and you want to repatriate your money back to your home country, we're going to start charging you just because your government has brought in unfair taxes. And are they even unfair? Countries are meant to be sovereign in tax. And this OECD thing, everyone signed up to it and the US helped negotiate it.
Now, one of the problems that led to this is that the US does have a twin deficit. And this is one way to address that, but it's a very painful way to address it because if you're running a fiscal deficit, it has to be funded somehow, and foreign capital flows plug that hole. If those dry up, sure, it'll reduce your fiscal deficit, but it's going to come at a cost.
Yeah, in some respects, the Trump administration has looked at the hand that feeds it and decided to take a big old bite out of it.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212. The platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and the lowest FX fees I could find on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers with Invest accounts can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which has no FX fees, true interbank rates, and offers 1% cashback on all transactions up to £20 per month. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1 and use the promo code RAMIN. That's RAMIN within 10 days of signing up, or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service, not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You are responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional. 212 cards are issued by Paynetics, which provide all payment services. Trading 212 provides customer support and user interface. Terms and fees apply.
So I think we've covered what Section 899 is, what it's intended to accomplish, and the fact that it's still got a long way to go to actually become law. But what if it does become law? What would it actually mean for us as investors sitting in the UK buying global funds or US funds?
Well, if you're a UK investor, and many of our listeners, I suspect, are global index fund investors, then 60% of your investment is going to be in US stocks. And this brings in the idea of withholding tax. Now, let's say that you own an S&P 500 fund, and it's paying out a dividend of 1.5%. So that's the dividend yield. What we're talking about here is increasing the withholding tax, which is currently about 15% if your ETF is domiciled in Ireland, to a potential 35%. Now, that might not sound like much. We're talking about an additional 20 percentage points on a dividend of 1.5%. So it's a percentage of a percentage. But that really adds up over time.
I've just done the maths, Robin, and you're talking about an extra 30 basis points here.
But look, this is the kind of thing we shop around for when we're comparing platforms, when we're comparing funds.
Yeah.
30 basis points can make a big difference.
Oh, yeah, it's more than the fund management fee.
So we've introduced this new thing called the GULP calculator. It's the gain to ultimately loss to professionals. So this is kind of like gain to loss to professionals. And let's say you've got a really cheap platform and cheap funds. You could probably run with annual fees of about 0.15% per year. Now, over a 30-year period, that compounds, but you'd only lose about 4% of your gains in total if your fees were that low.
Over how long, sorry?
So that's for a 30-year period. So now let's increase that by 30 basis points to annual fees of 0.45%. Well, now over a 30-year period, you're going to lose 15% of your gains. That's a huge difference. So these tiny little numbers add up over time because everything you pay in taxes and fees are ultimately not going to be compounding over a long period of time, particularly for young investors.
Oh, yeah. I saw that the Canadian Securities and Investment Management Association released a note saying that they estimate Canadian investors would lose around $59 billion from additional US taxes over the next 7 years. Gulp, to use your metaphor, Robin.
So I think if people understood that, it would be seen as a huge threat.
I guess the unspoken thing here is that dividends are surprisingly important for total return. Yes, the dividend yield might be like 1.5% or something, but that compounds and accounts for a large percentage of your gains.
Yeah, even for a country which is really stingy with its dividend payments like the US. So, for example, for the US, if you go from 1960 to the end of 2024, 85% of the cumulative return for the S&P would be due to reinvested dividends.
That's incredible, isn't it? 85% of your total return over that period. There was a nice white paper from Hartford Funds which made this really clear, which said that if you invested $10,000 in 1960 into the S&P 500, if you ignore dividends, by the end of 2024, that would have grown to almost $1 million, so $982,000. But if you're doing the sensible compounding thing and reinvesting those dividends along the way, rather than just under $1 million, by the end of the period, you'd have had $6,400,000. It's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's so hard to understand these compounding things because they're non-linear and they're really important. But I think if you don't understand it, it's really a problem for you as an investor.
I think it's fair to say dividends have become slightly less important over time. So if I look back at the dividend yield of the S&P 500 per year, in the 1960s, it bobbed around 3%. Then it rose up to a high of 6% at the start of the 1980s. And since then has declined to around 1.5%. And it's been at that level roughly since around 2000.
Because in the US, they have a lot more buybacks. So that's another way of paying back money to investors is to buy back your own shares, concentrate existing shareholders' ownings, and ensure that they get a larger percentage of the existing dividends.
Is that one way round this then for US companies? If you do buybacks, there's no withholding tax.
Maybe, they have to make themselves more attractive if they think that that's going to improve their marketability and, of course, boost their share price. Maybe that's one of the unintended consequences.
Because thankfully, the US is at least not talking about taxing us on our capital gains in US companies.
But not yet.
Hopefully we didn't just give him an idea.
Oh, no. Now, stepping away from our individual investments, which of course are what we care about, to the wider economic picture, I think there could be some huge impacts of this law if it is enacted as it stands, and particularly with Section 899.
I think maybe the most consequential bit of the legislation, which we touched on but haven't really focused on, is this idea that subsidiaries of international companies, like their branches in the US, could be penalised with these surtaxes. And that could obviously have major consequences for how multinationals choose to arrange their business, where they want to be headquartered, and where they want to put their capital at risk.
There's a nice quote from Emmanuel Chow, who's head of European equity strategy at Barclays. He said, "In our view, this is a risk for those companies generating US revenues and domiciled in countries that have enacted digital service taxes or are implementing the OECD's undertax payment rule." So precisely what you say, which is that for those companies, they're going to be negatively impacted by this change. And you'd have to consider whether it's worthwhile relocating your business to a more friendly country.
But presumably that's how this thing could ratchet up and put pressure on countries to scrap their digital service taxes, for example. Like if companies that are headquartered in the UK but with significant US earnings and operations decide, well, we're going to leave the UK for Dubai or whatever because they don't have a digital service tax and we won't get taxed on our US operations. If a lot of companies started doing that, then the pressure on the government in the UK would be significant. It's not just about appeasing the US, right? It's about appeasing companies.
I guess it really depends on how important the US market is to them. If they did consider that maybe it's worthwhile shifting back to Europe, then, that could be an own goal for the policy. So again, we're seeing this weird situation where a country that was once seen as one of our strongest allies is now seen as almost an enemy when it comes to business. Certainly it's less friendly than it used to be.
Oh, if this came in, for sure it's going to further strain relations between the US and, I want to say it's allies in Europe, but, that word seems a bit meaningless now. But one part of this bill that could strain relations even more is not just about companies, but about the fact it explicitly could apply to things like sovereign wealth funds and government investments in US assets, which up until now have been exempt from most US taxes. Not the case with this bill as currently written. Even things like foreign central bank holdings of US assets could be targeted by this. If you want a run on the dollar...
And we're already seeing a run on the dollar. I mean, it's not a sharp one, but we've steadily seen the US dollar losing value at the same time as we've had yields going up, which is a very, very odd situation and very worrying from the point of view of the Americans.
The interesting thing is whether or not this would apply to US treasuries, which is unclear, like we said. But if it did, then the effects could be profound. So I've got another quote from George Saravalos at Deutsche Bank, who says the de facto yield on US treasuries would drop by nearly 100 basis points. The adverse impact on demand for treasuries and funding the US twin deficit at a time when this is most needed is clear.
So 5% yield on treasuries and 20% in tax, and that's going to knock off about 100 basis points or 1 percentage point off the total yield, which is huge if you're a fixed income investor.
You'd think it would tilt the scale more for institutional investors and central banks and governments to hold things like bunds, maybe, instead of treasuries.
Yeah, I think that's one of the consequences.
If you want to boil all this down to a key question, maybe it's this. Do nations have their own fiscal sovereignty in a world where the US government is becoming belligerent and willing to weaponize its own tax system and the dollar?
And again, I think what this is going to do is to concrete these spheres of influence. For countries which trade mostly with China in the Far East, well, this is clearly going to tip the balances. For countries in Europe which sit kind of in the middle ground, we trade with the Far East, we trade with the US, then it's a much more difficult decision. And certainly when it comes to the UK, I bet that in future, once people are drafting new fiscal rules, when the Chancellor's making a budget, you bet they're going to be thinking, how is the US going to take this? And are we going to get retaliation? Certainly for the lifetime of this presidency.
It was interesting, wasn't it, that when there was this negotiation around a UK-US trade deal, it's not really a trade deal, but that's what they called it. In the build-up to that, a lot of people were speculating that the UK was going to scrap its digital service tax as a kind of tribute to the Trump administration. In the end, it didn't do that. We still have the digital service tax. It doesn't raise huge amounts of revenue, so it's something that could conceivably be scrapped. But you are showing significant weakness if you do that, I think. And then every time you have some kind of negotiation with the US, they're going to put pressure on you to tilt your own tax system in a way that favors their companies.
Yeah, there's going to be this éminence grise, or should I say éminence orange, in the room with the Chancellor as they're drafting the new budget every time it happens.
But all of this is outside of our control. There's a huge amount of political risk in the world at the moment. We know that. That's now being extended to capital and taxes and the movement of money around the world, which is worrying, isn't it, when we're global investors? But what should we do about it? We can't change policy. We can just watch what's going on and try and get ahead of it potentially. But the obvious question here is, if there's this idea that US assets might be taxed more heavily, should we consider dialing down our US allocation? We've seemingly come across this question so many times from so many different angles, right? The trade war, geopolitical risk, overvaluation potentially of US companies. But now we're coming at it from a new angle, which is the idea that we might be on the verge of capital controls.
Now, there is a way to avoid having to pay withholding taxes altogether for your US investments, and that's to hold a synthetic ETF. Now, the idea behind these synthetic ETFs is that the fund manager, when you give them your money, instead of owning the assets themselves, they'll do a total return swap with an investment bank, which actually sits in the United States. The investment bank holds the stocks on their own balance sheet. They don't pay withholding tax, and therefore indirectly, neither do you. Now, this is a loophole which may be closed in future. I don't know. Probably it will be.
Yeah, that would be my concern here, right? Currently, you're paying withholding tax on dividends, right? You're saying synthetic funds skirt this by not paying dividends, right? It's all returned to you as capital gain. What if the US decided to say, well, in these synthetic funds, we're going to say that's all a dividend. It all counts as dividend, right? Then you're going to be paying withholding tax on the whole lot. That's what they could do.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if it was Goldman, say, and they held it on their balance sheet, then what the government would have to say is those stocks which Goldman has bought and holds on its balance sheet, we're going to charge Goldman capital gains tax, because we know that the beneficial owner is ultimately going to be, I don't know, Joe Bloggs sitting in Europe. That's going to be really difficult to do.
Wouldn't they just tax the middleman bit, the total return swap, when the money actually passes from the investment bank to your fund manager?
I think that's the easier way, which is to simply say, look, these total return swaps are not going to be usable for retail investors. So, yeah, there are various ways they could block this. But at the moment, that still exists as a way of investing.
If the whole market quickly rotated to skirt US tax law and these synthetic funds proliferated, because at the moment they're quite a niche thing, right? Most of the funds people listening to this podcast will have invested in won't be synthetic. They'll be holding the actual assets. If it all turned around to react to legislation, then that gap you'd think would be plugged pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is one which is kind of flown under the radar because the funds weren't big enough.
And the other thing to note is that synthetic funds do have an additional risk, which is that you don't own the assets, right? You're relying on that investment bank paying you the money. And, you know, Goldman Sachs can go bankrupt, theoretically.
And there are fees involved which aren't included in the total expense ratio. So, yeah, I mean, there are other risks to think about here.
But we've started to answer this question of should we dial down our US allocation by saying implicitly, no, we'll just try and skirt the law. But I want to come back to the uncomfortable question. Is the US too risky to hold 60% of our assets in?
I think it's more risky. I think it's not necessarily too risky compared to other countries. And the reason why I say that is because I think the US, obviously, with these changes, is trying to improve its own economy. So it may be that this is successful, and the tariffs and also these new changes to do with capital may ultimately lead to better returns in future. So you'd be missing out on those returns if you excluded partly or completely the US from your investments. So I'm always really wary about saying, yeah, tilt away from the US, it's going to underperform. It's not going to be great in future because that's the widowmaker trade, right? So many people have betted against the US in the past for various reasons. And I think this will pass. I think this appetite for this kind of disruption in trade and tax will quickly dissipate once we move to a new president.
I saw that you said the exact same thing in your recent video. So it's good that you're consistent and you haven't seen this Section 899 and gone, whoa, I've changed my mind. I mean, I have to think that it's unlikely to come into law in exactly the way it's currently written. It would be a bit of a bombshell. And there are other things in this one big beautiful bill that are also pretty punishing on foreigners, even those living in the US. So there's talk of a remittance tax where money earned in the US and sent overseas could be taxed at 3.5%. So if you're a Mexican living in the US or a British person living in the US and you're sending money home from your earnings, yeah, that's a big tax you'd have to pay if this comes in. So there's all these things where it's starting to treat residents in the US and investors in the US differently based on domicile, which creates a lot of arbitrage opportunities, potentially. Just got to find a US person to earn the money on your behalf.
I guess my bigger concern is that this isn't just going to be a US thing, that we're going to see other countries adopting a similar approach where there's going to be some kind of friction when it comes to investing. And we'll look back to the period in which, yeah, you could invest in anything, it was really simple, into a new regime where you're always thinking, well, that country's got this tax, this country's got that tax, and having to weigh up those decisions.
For two people that hate talking about tax, that is not a world we want to invest in.
Now, with the world of investment changing so rapidly, it's really useful to have some feedback on your particular portfolio. And I do provide one-to-one coaching sessions. And if you want to learn more about those, just go to our website, pensioncraft.com/coaching to find out more.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week is, what is capital flight?
Now, usually this is to do with emerging markets. That's typically where this has been a problem. But it's when money which is flooded into a country because it was seen as a really hot investment suddenly decides they've made a mistake and the money floods out again just as quickly. And that destabilizes the country. So the country itself imposes controls on what money can leave.
If too many people are flying, it shuts down the airport.
Now, many countries have imposed this. For example, if you live in China, there were lots of capital controls, and I believe there still are. But the reason why it's destabilizing is that once the money floods out, then it increases things like the cost of capital. It increases the interest rates, because one of the ways you combat it is for the central bank to raise interest rates to attract capital back in. Now, if you've got a loan and you're a business, then your repayments increase, and so you see higher rates of default. That often leads to a banking crisis. You often see inflation as the currency devalues, and often it leads to regime change because the government becomes unstable. So there are a whole bunch of negative consequences of capital flight. So you can see why countries decide to impose a control. What we really haven't seen is a country like the United States imposing what's not quite a capital control, but it smells a little bit like a capital control.
Do you think me and you changing the allocation of our ISAs could do it? Bring down the government?
Yeah, that's going to tip it over the edge.
What's really worrying, I guess, is when your own citizens choose to push their money out of the country. And you often see that in kind of currency crises or fiscal crises. And there are ways around capital controls, you know, a suitcase full of cash.
Yeah, diamonds and toothpaste. There are many avenues which people have explored in the past.
I wish you'd told me toothpaste before I fled the borders. That would have been much less painful.
But my real issue with this and this policy is that it's addressing a fundamental problem about imbalance of trade in the United States, which it's not going to be able to solve. So the imbalance here is about US citizens consuming too much and not producing enough. And I don't think this is going to address that problem. Sure, it's going to be a good negotiating tactic because it is quite consequential in terms of investor returns. But I think the negative consequences, which is a growing mistrust of the United States, are going to be huge.
I guess it would take a lot to push me and you away from a global index fund. But if it escalates to the point that they did, and we dial down our US allocation, then I think you could say that's capital flight. It would take a lot to get us to that point.
And it's not that hard. All it means is 3 funds rather than 1. And nowadays, that's just not difficult to achieve.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.